And today we continue in the episodes of Vlad the Impaler. Today's episode is number 5 and it's called The Living Dead. Kind of apropos, isn't it? Welcome back to Mr. Giant Reacts and Ting and Ting and Ting. I'm Mr. Giant, and let's get right into The Living Dead of Vlad the Impaler. Let's YouTube and simmer.
1476, Constantinople. A messenger stands before Mehmet the Conqueror. He brings news of a victory against the tyrant Vlad III, who has massacred the faithful and spurned Mehmet's friendship. But the messenger didn't come alone. He carries a box, which upon its opening reveals the head of the treacherous, slain son of the dragon. Or, at least that's what one story says.
Oh.
Because like many of the stories in this series, the accounts of how Vlad died are contradictory. We just know that 2 months into his third reign, he fought a battle with the Ottomans and lost. In fact, it's kind of ironic that given all of the excruciating detail we have about how Vlad killed his foes, we know little about his own death. But death was not the end of Vlad Dracula. Because if there's one truth about human culture, it's this. When history doesn't provide a fitting end to a historical life, legend's gonna step in to finish the job. And Dracula refused to stay in the grave.
I don't know why I love this theme song so
Thanks
much.
so much to CuriosityStream for helping raise the stakes in historical storytelling. Despite his relatively brief time on the throne of Wallachia, less than 7 years in total, at the time of Vlad Dracula's death, he was already casting an outsized shadow over history. For instance, do you remember back in episode 3 when we talked about the parade of cruelty and massacre during Vlad's second reign? Well, one of those incidents that might have gotten lost in the sheer cacophony of awfulness was Vlad's massacre of Transylvanian Saxons in Brasov, an act that had huge consequences. See, those Saxons were German, and while they had come to the area a couple of centuries before, they still had family and trade ties with their homeland, which in the mid to late 15th century was one of Europe's greatest centers of printing and publishing. Now, many early books and pamphlets printed in Europe essentially functioned as political and religious propaganda. And after his massacres of Saxons in Brasov, Saxon printers made Vlad a favorite villain in their printings.
Ah,
As Vlad cooled his
makes
heels
sense.
as a captive in Hungary, he was becoming internationally famous for cruelty and butchery, a portrayal that only escalated after his death. Now, it's important to note that many of these stories printed about Vlad were exaggerated, and a bunch likely not true at all. In fact, we've been very careful to not draw on them too much as sources, and label said sources appropriately in the rare times that we do. Because while this genre of writing was originally intended to smear one's enemies, it also became a sort of early horror literature. Even as far back as the 15th and 16th centuries, the general rule for publications was, if it bleeds, it leads. Meaning stories of blood and guts sold well, particularly if they came along with gruesome woodblock prints. Even ostensibly serious religious books, like the 1563 publication Fox's Book of Martyrs, for instance, would get spiced up with lurid scenes of Protestants getting tortured or burned at the stake. Also, Catholic art and publications had a similar fascination with violent imagery, and the existing stories about Vlad served as a perfect jumping off point for German authors to create stories about him doing, well, basically any twisted thing they could imagine. The Ottoman.
No, as he's talking about that, and he's saying about how the stories about Vlad was exaggerated by the Germans, the German writers. Now, we have to take a step back and actually look at history, and I guess we're gonna have to decipher what is fact and what is not fact. If it's over exaggerated, could it be just that, over exaggerated? And that's why when I started watching these videos, I always ask about what the people that were part of this era and part of the events of this era, what did they think, especially the ones who actually witnessed whatever happened during that historical period. Are they prone to exaggeration too? Somebody have to tell the absolute truth there, you know what I mean? I don't think everybody's going to tell, you know what I mean? But then again, of course, too, the people, if they're not on the front lines or on the front of things, the stories coming down, could be well exaggerated too, because so many people exaggerate their military uh, encounters, I should say, or what's the word I'm looking for? The military, the time in the military. Like here, people are always like, I'm a veteran, I'm a veteran. But they spend most of the time in the military on bases here in America or in bases in Germany or where there's peace. They've never been to the front line. Doesn't make them a veteran. And they have stories like this guy I was to work with was with the Navy. He was in the Navy for about 2 or 3 years. He wasn't in there long because he left before the time was up. But he was telling me one time when I was speaking to him that they actually have machines that can manipulate the weather. And his basis for saying that is because he was in the Navy. So I'm in the Navy, I must be in the know. You see what I mean? So we have to be careful where we get the historical stories from, who we get it from, who won the conflict, because if the person who won the conflict is the one that's writing history, they're going to write it to make themselves look good, right? I mean, we all agree on that. Comment down below. Tell me what you think. You know what I mean? Is history a collaboration of the victors and the enemies writing the truth to come together and write the truth? Or, you know what I mean, those in charge. Well, yeah. I'll give you a perfect example. Even today, in this country, they're trying to get rid of teaching slavery. Some of the people have gotten so far to say that the slaves were better off under slavery. And these are politicians saying that. Well, they are the dominant race, for lack of a better word. And they get the privilege to write the history, despite the truth. Now, they have done a really splendid job of not letting that happen here. I have to admit it. Because they are taught in schools about slavery and stuff. Maybe not as in depth as they should, but at least they knew it happened. It wasn't the right thing, and I think the majority of people would not like to see it happen again. And that's the whole complication of history being written and who it's been written by and from what perspective, ideologically, religiously. You understand what I'm saying? Thing. Let's get back to this video here.
And similarly, we're happy to preserve stories about Vlad's awfulness since it justified removing him and made Hungary look bad for supporting him. Early biographers also played a part in this mythologizing, though sometimes to Vlad's benefit. For example, a Greek biographer who appreciated Vlad's years fighting the Ottoman Empire while acknowledging Vlad's cruelty also went out of his way to try and discredit Radu. This included claims that Radu converted to Islam, which is debatable, and that he and Mehmed were actually a gay couple, a portrayal historians also find suspect since it only exists in one very anti-Ottoman source. But before you come at us, all you Mehmed Radu stands, we're not saying this wasn't a thing, just that it's not totally established fact. Ooh, but you know what is a fact? Until this very series, Rob didn't know that people actually shipped historical figures. But now he can't unknow it. Anyway, one important thing to consider is that despite all of the things said about Vlad, he was never, in any sense, accused of being a vampire. That was the work of Irish writer Bram Stoker, who ran across accounts of Vlad as he prepared to write a vampire novel that would marry Romanian folklore with 19th century technology and medical knowledge. Now exactly how much inspiration Stoker took from Vlad has been hotly debated among historians. There are those who argue that he did extensive research on Romania, its folklore, and its history. Libraries he used have discovered margin notes in books on the subjects, and Jonathan Harker's journey into the Carpathian Mountains is broadly correct in its descriptions of routes, terrain, and even some local beliefs. Also in the novel, Stoker's Dracula even talks about raiding across the Danube and fighting the Ottomans in his life. But then the discovery of Stoker's notes in the 1970s turned a lot of these theories on their heads. Now, historians generally agree that Stoker knew little of Romania and essentially copied Harker's route and descriptions of the countryside from a 19th century traveler.
Oh, wow.
His descriptions of Dracula don't match Vlad at all, and he drew upon previous English vampire novels as much as Romanian folklore. His notes, in fact, don't even contain the name Vlad III. They do, however, seem very excited about the fact that several princes were from a family line called Dracula. So excited, in fact, that in his notes he actually scrawled, Dracula in Wallachian means devil, with Dracula and devil in all caps. In other words, he probably just liked the name, but didn't really know what it meant. Which actually was understandable, because by the 19th century, the word for devil and dragon had become interchangeable in Romania. Plus, the local folklore of the time had forgotten the Order of the Dragon connection, claiming that Vlad was called Dracula for his cruelty. But even though his knowledge on the references he drew from and translation of the name of its title character is flawed, let's also try to remember that Stoker originally named his vampire Count Wampir and titled the book simply The Undead. I know, Zoe, I wouldn't watch Christopher Lee in that either. So that's how the outside world knew Vlad the Impaler. From Stoker's moderately successful novel, to blockbuster play, television, and film adaptations, to Halloween costumes, games, and a whole tourism industry in Romania centered around Dracula's castle. A castle that Vlad probably never visited, and that Bram Stoker never saw. But
Oh,
don't let that
wow.
stop you from going, actually, because it's still a pretty freaking cool castle. But that international fame is only half the story. Because while everyone outside Romania saw Vlad as either a psychopath or blood-drinking Victorian monster, Romania itself had its own view. To speak very broadly, in the century after Vlad's death, Wallachia and Moldavia became Ottoman tributary states, whereas Transylvania remained independent for 2 centuries before falling under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At times, between 2 and 3 of the kingdoms shared the same monarch, drawing them closer together. Then by the 19th century, the 3 had enough of a shared sense of identity that they launched a series of simultaneous rebellions with the goal of independence. Finally, in 1878, in the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War, Wallachia and Moldavia united to form Romania and later added Transylvania after World War I. And a core component of 19th century nationalism was drawing historical heroes out from history. And at a time when Wallachia and Moldavia were struggling for independence from Ottoman rule, Vlad the Impaler fit the mold of a hero that spoke to the present issue. In Romania, he was seen as a brutal but fair ruler who kept Wallachia independent for a time and died defending his land from greater powers. Now, if you've watched all this series, you've probably concluded that Vlad cared more about gaining and keeping personal power than any noble cause. But as is often the case with nationalistic heroes, this was ignored in favor of a story that fit more neatly with 19th century Romanian politics. The image of Vlad as an independence fighter, doing what had to be done to keep his kingdom independent from the Ottomans, just felt true at the time, and turned Vlad into a national symbol. Though to be fair, even though Vlad remains a celebrated figure in modern Romania, many Romanians continue to debate over whether the country should really be proud of him. Who'd have thunk it? This stuff's complicated. But all of these disparate opinions of Vlad's story only served to make it more interesting. From a life that was messy, often confusing, and of, let's just say, ambiguous loyalties, later writers have crafted Vlad into everything from a nationalist icon, to horror character, to folklore figure, to literary vampire, and to bait for tourist traps. Meaning, he's a fascinating study in how, if you're famous enough, one day you may end up rising from your grave to become something else entirely. Which makes you want to take a good look in the mirror, doesn't it?
I thoroughly enjoyed this series. Of course, I come out of the series a little bit confused about who Vlad the Impaler actually was. You know what I mean? Especially with the years of fictitious stories coming out about him and his life and all of that. Uh, the dude probably was just well, not just another, no offense there, but you know what I mean? He was another fighter who wanted to liberate his people, but was vilified after death, and even more after death by fiction, and then, turned into a tourist attraction. That stuff is interesting. I'll leave a link in the description to this video. I'll also leave links to the other Vlad the Impaler episodes that I've watched so far. This is the 5th and final one. I hope you guys enjoyed this series as much as I did. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Listen, man, y'all take care of each other, alright? Cool runnings.